Thank you, sir.
You're welcome, Mark. This mouse sometimes misbehaves.
Oh, okay, so it has to just use the keyboard. Okay. Or if I want to switch, I want to see if there are. Okay. Okay, it's touch screen. All right. Thank you, sir. All right, good afternoon. I can see we have just about 6 people online. I think we'll wait for some minutes for more people to join before we start. So you can call others and tell them the class is about to start. Thank you. All right, I think someone should put it on your class group that the class has started so that more people can join before we start. Let's still hold on for more people. Let's still hold on for more people. Yes, it was. There are 34 online, I think. Yeah. We have about 2,000 plus that are registered. Still no.
But we think was sent.
Yes, it was. Yes. All right, I can see that more people have joined. Please keep informing them that the class has started so that we can have more people online. We'll start soon. As soon as we have enough people online, we can commence the class. People listening together, participating together. Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to PHL 101 class, Introduction to Philosophy 1. Today, I'll introduce you to another branch of philosophy, African social and political philosophy. I'm Dr. Badejo. I think Dr. Okore thought you what do we understand by African social and political philosophy? What exactly do we mean when we talk about African social and political philosophy? African social and political philosophy, as the name suggests, is divided into two aspects. We have the social aspect and we have the political aspect. The social aspect of African social and political philosophy is concerned with the conceptions of society in Africa, social relations in communities, personhood, morality, historical realities, and experiences of African people. While the political aspect examines the African conception of leadership, authority, justice, okay. So the political aspect examines the African conceptions of leadership, of authority, justice, communal life, social order, power, rights, democracy, socialism, communalism, and resource control in African societies. So we have our way of life that is peculiar to the African people. And African social and political philosophy examines critically the social and political aspects of the African experience. Now, we can then define African social and political philosophy as the aspect of philosophy or the arm of philosophy that critically examines the African ideas of social order, power distribution, and political authority grounded in indigenous traditions and colonial and post-colonial experiences. I believe that you understand what we mean by colonial and post-colonial experiences or era. The colonial era can define that as the period that African nations were colonized, and the post-colonial era, we can characterize that one as the period that colonialism ended in African communities. So it might differ from one society or from one nation to the other, but every African nation, or almost every African nation, has colonial and post-colonial era. And so African social and political philosophy examines some aspects of these two eras, examines the experiences of the African people during these two eras. So simply put, African social and political philosophy articulates African perspectives on community, power, and social relations from the pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial experiences for the common good of the African people. So we can say that the key concern of African social and political philosophy is how power is organized and exercised for the overall common good. So what is the origin of African social and political philosophy? We can trace the origin. And we have different scholars that argue on how African social and political philosophy emerged. But one thing that we need to understand is that African social and political philosophy started before the colonial era. We cannot say that it started in the colonial era. It started before the colonial era. Might not be in the academic form as we have it now, might not be written, but already through experiences, African nations had African social and political philosophies. Though not written, but we can gather them, or we can gather our experiences together and sieve out our African social and political philosophy from that period. And during this era, African social and political philosophy was grounded in communal living, in kinship, in obligations rather than laws, council of elders, and age grades. So the African social and political philosophy of this era was transmitted through oral traditions. So there are some things we know in the African society, that there are things that were passed from one generation to another orally. That means something your forefather told you, or your great-grandfather told you, or your great-grandmother told you, and you pass it from one generation to another. So in the pre-colonial era, African people did not have a culture of writing as we have now. So our traditions was passed orally one generation to the other. So we can examine this aspect of the pre-colonial, we can examine the pre-colonial era and sieve out how African people associated with themselves, how they related with themselves socially, and how their societies were governed, to get out our African social and political philosophy from this era. Now, the academic or written form of African social and political philosophy, the type that we are examining today, that we are studying now, emerged during colonialism and the post-colonial era. And it came as a result of reactions. A lot of Africans that were trained in the Western form of education, some of them were taken out of the country to study. They believed that the West had misconceptions about Africans. They also believed that African traditions were being twisted and lost over time. And so they felt that they had this major concern, that they had to do something, that the impact of colonialism on our indigenous societies was so much then, that they felt that something had to be done to restructure African societies. And that is how African social and political philosophy emerged in its academic unwritten form. So they argue that colonialism led to identity crisis. People stopped understanding the indigenous aspect of our culture. Then there are misconceptions of African thoughts, conflicts between indigenous and modern ideas. There are things that people now started, it became difficult for people to differentiate between traditional and modern ideas. For example, some people will tell you that it is a tradition for a woman to change her name to her husband's own when she gets married. And we have, however, the truth is that it is not an indigenous practice, but a practice that came through colonialism. So we have some of these conflicts between indigenous and modern ideas. We have struggles over resources in Africa. There were issues of freedom, about justice and self-rule. And all these concerns led to the emergence of African social and political philosophy. These scholars started interrogating how colonialism has affected African societies in the aspect of social and political aspects. And they championed the academic form of African social and political philosophy. And some of these scholars are Kwame Nkrumah, we have Leopold Sedar Senghor, We have Obafemi Awolowo. I know some of you would have heard about Obafemi Awolowo, even if you have not heard about Kwame, Nkrumah, and Senghor. But I believe you would have heard about Obafemi Awolowo, Julius, Nyerere, and we also have Ifeanyi Mekiti. These scholars are not restricted to the ones I mentioned here. They are just examples. So what we'll do now is to examine briefly the thoughts, the ideas of some of these scholars, so as to have an idea of what there's a note that I'll still pass to you through the classrooms. That note is self-explanatory, but it's also better that I explain, you get the explanation yourself, and if you have questions, you can ask before you interact with the note. I'll also drop this slide too alongside the note so that you can have a comprehensive idea of what we're talking about. And these philosophers, what they did, you know that when you're talking about philosophy, you are talking about critical examination. They examined they critically examined the impact of colonialism and the aftermath or the force on African societies. And in so many cases, they advocated political thoughts and models for African communities. And what I mean by the advocated, they suggested how African societies should be governed and how people should interact with themselves in African societies. They talked about justice, they talked about democracy, they talked about resource control, they talked about violence and some other aspects of our social and political lives. So now we'll start with Julius Nyerere, and his most popular work, African social and political philosophy, is called Ujamaa, which he wrote in 1960s. Julius Nyerere was the first president of Tanzania, and he did not just propose a system of governance or social structure for African societies, but he also acted in Tanzania. And the meaning of Ujamaa means familyhood or brotherhood. And what Julius Nyerere proposed is that he argued that before colonialism, Africans used to live as brothers, as a family. And what he meant as a family is not the basic nuclear family units that we are used to now. African societies have this communal form of living where people interacted with themselves as a family, they lived as a family, and it did not matter whether they were related by blood or not. And so here was arguing that Africans need to go back to this type of communal living as our form of social and political philosophy. And he argued for, and he called it a type of African socialism, which is different from the socialism in its Western form, because this type of socialism is not based on theories, but based on communal values. And some of the major characteristics of Ujamaa is that Nyerere argued that in this community, the traditional African community, everybody was a worker. They didn't have anybody that was idling or anybody that was lazy, and that people gathered wealth based on their needs. They gathered wealth based on their needs. They argued that land was jointly owned by people in the society. So we didn't have a case where someone will own 300 acres of land and say that it belongs to my family and my family alone. The state or the society owned the land, and people work on the land. And when there's an harvest, it did not belong to personal people. They give to each person according to their needs. And people also worked according to their strengths. And Nyerere argued that exploitation and oppression, they are characteristics of capitalism that came into African societies through colonialism. And that to get rid of these things that are injuring Africa, we have to go back to African socialism, which is deeply rooted in Ujamaa. Nyerere argued that African socialism ensured that everybody in the society is well taken care of, even if you are too old to work, and if you are too weak or too sick to work, the society will take care of you. And he argued that the reason why African society started having problems, economic problems or problems with resource control, was because we're adopting the capitalism that came with colonialism. That if you can go back to Ujamaa, that is the African socialism rooted in communal values, we will stop having those problems. You just need to get what you need from the society and not what you want. And Nyerere also argued that our skills as Africans should be used for the society and not for us. And so if you have a case where you are strong enough, for example, to make 200 hips to plant yams, you are not expected to go home with all the harvest. You only take what you need according to the number of people you have in your family, and remaining will go to the society to take care of every other person in the society. And it is believed that even as a visitor, I welcome you for a few days, and after the few days, they give you hoe and cutlass to go and work. Nyerere will argue that Africans did not have personal millionaires. People in a society were as rich or as poor as the resources of that society. And so Nyerere argued that African societies should go back to that Ujamaa, familyhood or brotherhood based on communal values. And now, what are the strengths of this Ujamaa? You know, in philosophy, we cannot talk about a theory or examine a scholar without looking at the strengths and weaknesses of their suggestions of their theory. So the first thing is that Ujamaa is based in strong moral foundation because it frowns at oppression and it frowns at exploitation. So that is one good aspect of Ujamaa. It also tries to showcase African society and communal living in a positive light. It emphasizes equality of everyone in the society. So whether you are old, whether you are young, whether you are weak, whether you are strong, nobody in the society is better than the other. It emphasizes equality and it is inclusive. The theory accommodates everyone. Nobody is left out. So if you are physically challenged, the state is supposed to take care of you. If you are old, the state is supposed to take care of you. If you are ill, the state is supposed to take care of you. If you are too young to work, the state is supposed to take care of you. So it is inclusive. It takes care of everyone in the society. But then Ujamaa is also criticized for some things. And the first one is that it is criticized for its over-romanticization of traditional African communalism. And what do I mean by that? It means that Nyerere exaggerated the communal living that Africans used to have in the past. A lot of people will argue with you that it is not true that there was no exploitation and oppression in the traditional African past or in our indigenous societies. We had slavery. We had societies that went to war against each other and captured people from other societies and took them. Even in a society, you have families that were known as slaves. You have families that were, they had class systems. So it seems as if Nyerere exaggerated the communal living that Africans had in the past. Then his theory can encourage low productivity. As human beings, we can be naturally selfish. So if I'm strong enough to make 200 hips, but I know that at the end of the day, they will tell me that my family is only entitled to 20 tubers because of equality in the society. Why should I work that hard? Why should I make the 200 tubers? I'm not saying that it's only affects or is only related to farming. I'm just using farming as an example. So if my skills can go as far as producing 500 products, but I know at the end of the day, I'll only be giving 5, maybe because I live alone or I have just one child, I will not be motivated to work hard. So as evil as Nyerere thinks capitalism has a way of encouraging people to be more productive. And if we adopt Nyerere's Ujamaa, it might lead to low productivity. Another problem with Ujamaa is it can lead to extreme state control, authoritarianism. When you have the states taking care of too many things, the state takes care of all the resources, including land, including your labor, including the products, it can lead to authoritarianism, where the states might actually end up as the oppressors. And so it is not foolproof as Nyerere thinks it will be. Another problem I have with Ujamaa is that aside the fact that it can lead to low productivity and extreme state control and the over-romanticization of the traditional African past, Nyerere also underestimated human nature. Human nature is not as orderly as Nyerere thinks it is, where people will just sit down and they cooperate and work as they are suggested. Human beings are not like that. It will take more to get human beings to just work together than just telling them that you are brothers, you are a family. So Nyerere did not actually consider human nature. We have much more than but I'll stop now. You can get some other things from the notes or in your own private studies. And okay, now we'll move to Kwame Nkrumah. And his popular work is Consciencism, which he wrote in 1964. He was also the first president of Ghana and also tried to make his philosophy practical apart from theoretical. And the keynote or the key points of Nyerere's philosophy is that he argued for post-colonial African unity. Is similar to Nyerere in some aspects, that if we come together as a brotherhood. Now, unlike Nyerere that argued that we should go back to the traditional African past, Nkrumah argued that it is impossible to go back to the past. And so he tried to look for a way to harmonize all the aspects of the traditional, of the African society, of the modern African society. We have the traditional aspects, we have religion introduced by the West, we have Western education. So Nkrumah was trying to look for harmony, was trying to look for like a center point. How can we harmonize all these aspects to work for the overall good of the tradition of the African society? We cannot go back to the past. We cannot undo colonialism. We cannot undo what colonialism introduced to Africa. But how can we make things work in our favor? We don't need to throw our past away totally, but we don't need to accept everything that has been introduced to us. So is there a way we can pick out every useful aspect of all these things, match them together, have an harmony that will work for African societies? He also argued for a form of African socialism, but not the type that is rooted in going to the African past, but a type that also defends equality, just like Nyerere. And he also rejects capitalism and exploitative systems. And it's, like I said, it's similar to Nyerere, but a point of departure is that it's not advocating going back to the traditional African past. It's advocating finding an harmony between all aspects of the African society, the past and what colonialism introduced, and the effects of colonialism that we still have in the post-colonial era. And just like Nyerere, Nkrumah's Consciencism too has strengths and weaknesses. The first strength of Nkrumah's Consciencism is that it offers a coherent framework for reconciling every aspect of the African society. He tries to reconcile African indigenous religion with Islam, with Christianity, try to find a way to integrate the traditional education, the traditional form of education with the Western form of education for the overall good of the African people. He also emphasized the integration of ethics and politics. He argued that you cannot have a good politics if the moral aspect of the society is not in order. So he attempted an integration of both. Another strong aspect or another strength of his philosophy is that it promotes social justice, equality, and the collective welfare of people in the African society. And he also has his own weaknesses. Just as in Nyerere, he has also been criticized for over-romanticization of the traditional African past. It's also believed that he exaggerated it, painted it as more positive than the realities that people have about this era. Then, just like Nyerere, there's a tendency that it can lead to extreme state control. That means it can become authoritarian in practice when it is practiced. And then Nyerere's Nkrumah's consciencism is such that it can be too difficult for people that are, for the layman, people that are not too tuned to philosophy, people who do not understand philosophy, might be too difficult for them to understand. And they cannot understand it. That means that in policy, in implementing these policies, there will be difficulties. It is not clear enough, it is not simple enough for those that are not too academic and those that are not used to philosophy to understand. He leaned a lot on Karl Marx. He used a lot of Karl Marx's work to explain his work, which might be strange to those that are not used to philosophy. So that is one other weakness of Nkrumah's work. Now we move to Leopold Sédar Senghor. I don't know if you are familiar with that name too, and his popular work is Negritude, which he wrote in 1964. He was a philosopher and also if you read his work, you see the influence of his literature, you see that poetry in his manner of writing. And the key points, the main aspect of Senghor's philosophy is that he advocated for, he affirmed an African cultural identity. You know, he was trying to respond to the effects of colonialism, and he was trying to respond to the racism that he also experienced as a person. And so he tried to affirm the cultural identity of the African people, tried to took us back to the past and wanted people to understand who they really are all over again, to correct the identity crisis that a lot of Africans already had at that moment. And so he emphasized emotion, he emphasized intuition and communal life in understanding our African cultural identity. Also get more from the notes when you get that from your class rep. And just like the other scholars, he also has his own strengths and weaknesses. Just like others, he also exaggerated the African culture, the traditional African past. And although Negritude is culturally rich, but it is argued that as a governance model, as a model for social and political, as a social and political structure, it is vague, to be difficult to implement as a governance model. And also, it is also argued that in a way, he reaffirmed the colonial stereotypes that he was trying to dismantle. He has been accused of pandering to racism in some aspects too, and as he did not entirely dismantle racism and the effects of colonialism in his work. And so it's like he reaffirmed some of these stereotypes that Africans are trying hard to run away from. But the strength of his work is that he inspired African, he inspired the Black consciousness movement that became very popular in Africa for many years, and he contributed largely to Pan-African thought. He was also able to affirm our communal values and also to work on the reclamation and pride. He was able to encourage Africans to be proud of their heritage once again. And so that is another strength of Senghor's attitude. And so we move to Obafemi Awolowo, which I think some of you are familiar with, and his work is democratic socialism. He was a Nigerian nationalist and a political thinker. He was a politician and a nationalist. And the key point of the democratic socialism is that he believes that the major aspect of socialism or democracy should concentrate on welfare and social justice in the African society. That you cannot have democracy without strong welfare and social justice. Awolowo supported free education and healthcare. Not only did he support it, to a large extent, he implemented it in his region. And so we still have a lot of beneficiaries of his free education and healthcare, and that played a major role in how educated the southwestern part of Nigeria is today. He implemented it apart from just talking about it. He defended democracy. He argued for federalism, he argued for the rule of law. But like I said, the key point of all this is state welfare, and social justice. He argued that there cannot be development without education. And if you cannot have development without education, it follows that education should be free so that it will be accessible to all. If education is accessible to all, then there will be no excuse not to be developed. And so he also has his own strengths and weaknesses. The first one is the strong welfare orientation. I already mentioned that the free health and free education programs helped the southwestern part of Nigeria, especially. It has helped a lot, and the traces can still be seen. And then his commitment to democracy and the rule of law, that's all his strengths. He emphasized the rule of law while practicing democracy. And his ideas translated into concrete social programs. He went beyond theories. He produced books, there were free uniform, and many other things that he did to advance free education and free healthcare in Nigeria. However, it's argued that his work lacks philosophical depth. It's not so philosophical. And then the state-heavy welfareism. At the end of the day, it was discovered that it could not be maintained. The state could not maintain that welfare program that Awolowo introduced. It was too much for the state to handle, so it eventually collapsed. And some of his policies were unevenly implemented. Its limited nationwide impact was more, the impact was felt in some aspects of the nation, but not felt in some other aspects of the nation. And so the spread did not allow the policies, the programs to be as successful as they should have been. Okay, so that's Awolowo. Now we go to Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon was an anti-colonial philosopher. He was also a psychiatrist, and he wrote a book called Wretched of the Heart. And that book, he worked really on the psychological effects of colonialism on African people. He was able to trace how colonialism has affected the psyche of African people and how the psychological effect reflects in how we live today in our social interactions and in our politics. And he also argued against post-colonial elite domination. One key factor of Frantz Fanon's work is that he argued that colonialism was very violent. It was implemented violently, and if you want to uproot colonialism and the effects of colonialism, you cannot do it through negotiations. If something was implemented violently, it must be uprooted violently. And so Frantz Fanon is usually called the advocate of violence when it comes to fighting colonialism in African nations. And so let's look at the strengths and weaknesses of his work too. It exposes the psychological, the social and economical harmful aspects of colonialism. Was able to break this down, how colonialism affected social relations, affected resource control, and the psyche of the African societies. His work has very good global influence. His work is more read than most other scholars globally. It is not only restricted to African societies and African scholars. It has a wide global influence. And it also encourages structural social transformation that starts from changing the mindset of the people and that will evolve into transformation that we can see, that we can experience. But the weaknesses of his policies, of his philosophy is first the justification of violence. It argued that Frantz Fanon work is too violent, or his recommendations are too violent, and that given what Africa has gone through, if we should go through that path of trying to use violence to uproot or to fight against what has happened to African societies, Africa will end up losing more because they might not be able to withstand more violence than the violence African societies already experienced. So its justification of violence is a problem for many people. Then it is also argued that Frantz Fanon downplays diplomacy, downplays negotiations and peaceful resistance in his work, that there's a way that all these things too can produce results that Fanon probably argued. Yes, I do. That should I give them now? Huh? Yeah, you have the first one. I believe you've been giving the first code on your group chat, so I'll give you the second one now. The code for attendance, right? So I'll give you the second one now. So the code is, that's the second code, 5XADP. 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 That is the code. 5XADP. If you have questions, you can also put it in the chat. If you have questions, you can put in the chat so I can look at them and answer them. So the second code is 5XADP. 5XADP. I hope you got that. 5XADP. All right, so let's go back to the class. So I already mentioned the justification of violence as one of the weaknesses of Wretched of the Heart. How Fanon downplayed diplomacy and negotiation in restructuring African societies or in fighting for practical governance. And then it is also argued that he did more of criticizing than offering solutions. He talked about how colonialism has affected Africa, but did not come up with enough practical governance and social solutions. So these are the weaknesses of Frantz Fanon's work. So the next philosopher we'll look at is Kwame Gyekye. So we have Kwame Gyekye, and his work is on African communalism. Gyekye is a Ghanaian moral and political philosopher who defended moderate communalism in African society. He tried to balance his community values with individual rights. Now, how can a society exist, or how can a society be governed such that you preserve the community values without eroding the rights of the person? And he also emphasized moral responsibility and leadership while building a state. He also critically examined African cultural values. Like I said before, you get more from the notes that I will send later, but these are the key points of Gyekye's African communalism. And what are the strengths and weaknesses of Gyekye's African communalism? The first strength is that it has a balanced view of the community and the individual. While it's trying to talk about the community, also talk about how it affects the individual. You cannot talk about the community without the individual. You cannot talk about the individual without the community. And so another strength of Gyekye's African communalism is that there's an emphasis on morality and responsibility in the state. He emphasized on morality and responsibility. Then he also, as much as possible, tried to make his philosophy to be compatible with global human rights. Tried to make it to be compatible with global human rights. But just like the other philosophers, there are also weaknesses. And the first one is that in a lot of cases, he was ambiguous about individual rights. He was very ambiguous about individual rights. And he also underestimated social oppression for women and minorities. When he talked about rights, he didn't do enough to protect the rights of women, children, and the minorities in the society. His political institution is also argued that his analysis of political institution is also weak, not strong enough. It's also weak, not strong enough. And so we move to Wiredu. And his popular work is Democracy by Consensus. It is also from Ghana, an analytic philosopher from Ghana that advocated participatory and consensus-based democracy, which is similar to the democracy we know now, but rooted in African values. So we have some points of divergence rooted in African values. He criticized the blind adoption of Western values, excuse me, and he promoted moral leadership and public reasoning, in democracy, and he tried as much as to integrate our indigenous values with modern democratic ideas, try to match both together, traditional and modern democratic ideals. And his democracy by consensus actually argue that it is not the type that we go to the ballot where you cast your vote, but it is based on a communal setting. And the elders come together, they lead it, and there's a way that successors they make decisions, and that is the type of democracy. It's a form of indigenous democracy that Wiredu emphasized, which is rooted in, I think, the Akan culture. We wanted to use the democracy practice in Akan culture to build a modern form of democracy for African societies. And then just like others, there are also strengths and weaknesses. It is relevant because a lot of African nations now that are leaning towards democracy. So his work is relevant, and he emphasizes participation. He does not want to leave anyone behind. It is inclusive, and it's in a way, if you find a way that you can bring everything on board, it is believed that it's a form of democracy can reduce adversarial politics. That is big politics that you take yourself to court, you fight, you have one movement against the other. His own form of democracy is not the type where you have parties. It's a type where the society will deliberate and come up with a consensus. And by the time they argue back and forth and come up with a consensus, they know how to appease to others. And in that way, adversarial politics will be minimal, bitter politics will be minimal, anger when it comes to politics will be minimal in the society. And he also promotes rational deliberation. Believes that deliberations should be reached rationally and not rationally by a group of people where everybody in the society participates. There's a way that you can have your deliberations rationally to come up with what will work for the benefit of everyone in the society. It is argued, however, it also has its own weaknesses. And the first one is that it is difficult for large and modern states to adopt democracy by consensus, because what Wiredu argues for is a type of communal democracy where people sit down, maybe in a town hall, and bring up ideas. So how many town halls do you want to have in a society where you can reach a consensus? So where you have large and modern states, it will be difficult to have practical democracy by consensus. Then it is believed that there's a risk of silencing minority views, just as we have in the modern democracy. Modern democracy silences the views of the minority, and it is also possible that that will happen if we have democracy by consensus. And then we have the problem of slow decision making. If you have to deliberate, if many people will have to participate, you have to wait for this household to bring their input. You have to wait for that household to bring their input. Then it ends up that you have a slow decision-making process, and it will be very difficult to get progress in those type of societies. So we have looked at the definition of African social and political philosophy, and I said that it is the branch of philosophy that critically examines the African ideas of social order, power distribution, and political authority grounded in indigenous traditions and colonial and post-colonial experiences. That is, it articulates African perspectives on community, on power, on social relations from the pre-colonial era, the colonial era and post-colonial era for the common good of the African people. We also looked at the origin of African social and political philosophy. It started before the academic form that we have now. It started in the indigenous traditional era of African societies, but in the academic form that we have today, in the written form that we have today, it started as major concern to how indigenous practices were eroded by colonialism. Then we have, we also looked at some works of some of these African scholars, such as Nyerere's Ujamaa. We have Nkrumah's Consciencism. We have Senghor's Negritude. We looked at Obafemi Awolowo, democratic socialism. We looked at Frantz Fanon, decolonization, and Gyekye's African communalism, and Wiredu's democracy by consensus, and the strengths and weaknesses of all these scholars. We looked at some strengths and weaknesses. I'll also encourage you to go and do some research on them. You get more. If you do some research on them, you get more, you know more about their works, and then you can also identify some strengths and weaknesses on your own. And so, like I said earlier, on thoughts on African social and political philosophy, they are not limited to those examined here. They are just examples of the rich body of work on this branch of philosophy. So there are still many scholars, but we'll just examine this for now. And this branch of philosophy provides a rich framework for understanding how African societies organize themselves, govern, and relate to one another. So although you did not live in the pre-colonial era or the colonial era, you can know some things about these two eras from the works of these scholars. It also provides alternatives to Western political models. These scholars attempt to suggest political models that work for Africa or that are peculiar to African societies. And they try to look into the past to get some things that can work for the African societies. So they tried to provide alternatives to Western political models. And so it remains relevant to contemporary African challenges even today, because African struggles with the political model. So it is quite relevant to African societies today. So we'll stop there for now. If you have questions, I will give us some minutes to put our questions in the chat box. And then, like I promised earlier, I'll send the slides and a notes. I have a more comprehensive notes, which is self-explanatory, that you can read on your own through the reps. So I'll wait for some time. I'll try to catch my breath and sit for some time and come back to check the chat box for questions. Then before you go, you wait for the last code for attendance. So I'll give us some time. Certain chat disconnected. Chat disconnected.